Good morning, everyone. We are so pleased to have three wonderful speakers today on our webinar to talk about the landmark step that was taken in Australia to in terms of corporate accountability, specifically linked to Uyghur forced labor. So we are here today with Ramila Chanishev, who's the president of the Australian Uyghur Tangrata Women's Association, Freya Dinshaw, Associate Legal Director at the Human Rights Law Center, specializing on corporate accountability, and Jennifer Canis, as solicitor from Morris Blackburn Lawyers, representing Ottawa as well. So welcome to all of you. We're very pleased to have you join this conversation today. My name is Miratai Erkin. I'm the Vice President of the World Uyghur Congress, and I'm glad to be moderating this wonderful panel with our speakers. First of all, I want to congratulate all of you for launching this massive legal action in Australia, which I believe is the first. And corporate legal accountability, especially linked to Uyghur forced labor, has been something that is, I think, a lot of Uyghur organizations, specifically the World Uyghur Congress, has been doing in the last few years. You may be aware that the World Uyghur Congress has also launched a legal case against the UK authorities, specifically the National Crime Agency, for their failure to investigate imports linked to Uyghur forced labor. And just last year, during the appeal case in the UK courts, we actually won. And so the court has found that the UK National Crime Agency's decision not to launch an investigation into the importation of cotton products and manufactured by forced labor in East Turkestan was unlawful. So this was also a landmark win. We also had other cases that were ongoing, and then also, of course, the universal jurisdiction case that we have started in Argentina a couple years ago. So, of course, this case is major in Australia, not only significant within the Uyghur community, but also in the corporate sector. And I think this speaks volume about the action that you've taken. So perhaps, Ramila, perhaps this case has made, as you know, national headlines. And have you, during the whole process, how was the reaction from the Uyghur community? Because of course, it's not something that you can do alone. I think you need to be supported by your community, especially in those moments. It's something that we've experienced as well during the Uyghur Tribunal, for example, or even the legal case in the UK. So how was the reaction and the support you received from the Australian Uyghur community?
It's been fantastic. I think this is something that's going to bring us together again, and it had been quiet in Australia in terms of activism for Australian Uyghur, sorry. You know, we couldn't talk about the case, even though we've been working together with these two lovely ladies for the past how many years. The support is fantastic, and it's not just the Uyghur community that's been giving us support since then. I think the wider Australian community as well is being educated about forced labor, and especially Uyghur forced labor.
Absolutely, as you said it, I think the support comes from everywhere and everyone. And I think that's also something that's major. Freya, you're legal director, associate legal director at Human Rights Law Center. So from a legal standpoint, what makes this case very significant or even precedent setting under Australian law?
And so this case is a really significant one because we believe it's the first of its kind to seek to bring real accountability to retailers in relation to potential reliance on Uyghur forced labor or forced labor in overseas supply chains in the Australian courts in general. And it provides a signal to companies that consumers expect that what they're saying should be matched by their actions. And so what this case is really testing is whether Kmart's actions meet its words when it comes to what it says it's doing to ensure that its goods aren't produced with forced labor.
Thank you. Perhaps, Jennifer, you could maybe you could walk us through the legal strategy without giving us too much information, of course. What does this discovery application aim to uncover? And how is it going to shape broader consumer law cases in Australia moving forward?
So one of the really interesting things about this case is it has been brought under in relation to Australian consumer law. And that law really regulates how companies act in relation to providing goods or services to the public. And so what we are saying is that we have a reasonable belief that Kmart has made, that the representations that Kmart makes about their ethical sourcing are not backed up by their actions. And we've done a lot of investigating, and we've looked at the supply chains and had a look at the companies within the supply chain. And we've got quite a lot of evidence, but we really need to know what Kmart knew and what they have done. And so what this case is what's called a preliminary discovery application. And we're saying to Kmart, show us the documents that you have to back up your ethical clothing claims. Show us the audits. Show us any of the correspondence you've had with your suppliers. And that's quite an unusual step to take. And it will be, it's come at the end of quite a bit of correspondence between ourselves and Kmart, and where we haven't got any of the documents that we've been asking for. And so we really had no choice but to go to the court to seek this application, or to make this application. And really, we won't know what next step to take until we see these documents, and that will inform the next steps that we may or may not take in this proceeding.
Yes, so usually you can secure these documents, so you can even get these documents from these companies if they're actually being transparent, right?
Well, we have no, the documents that we've asked for, I think Kmart should be providing, but they've got no obligation to publish those documents publicly. But we certainly say that in order to back up their claims about being ethical, they can't be empty words, and that they do need to actually provide the evidence to show that they are sourcing their products in an ethical way.
Right. So you said this case was brought up under the consumer law in Australia. So perhaps, I mean, this question can be, to you and also Freya, but how does Australia's Modern Slavery Act come in? Has it been useful in this case, or, I remember the Australian Modern Slavery Act was reviewed in 2022. Does it fall short when it comes to holding companies accountable for links to forced labor?
Look, I think Freya can add a bit more in relation to this, but I think that it's really significant to note that Ramilla and her organisation is bringing this case because there is no other way to effectively deal with it. And it really shouldn't be up to individuals to be taking on big organisations to seek justice and to seek knowledge about forced labour. But Freya, you can talk a little bit more about the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah, sure. So the Australian Modern Slavery Act was introduced in 2018, and what it does is it requires companies to report on what are their risks of modern slavery in their supply chains and what they're doing to address those risks. However, it essentially has no teeth. So there are no penalties for failing to put in a statement, for putting in a misleading statement, or for putting in a statement that says you've got risks but you're not doing anything about them, or any which way. It's a fairly soft piece of legislation, so it's been important in terms of awareness raising. But a review that was independent in 2023 found that there was no evidence that it had actually been effective at assisting people that the Act was intended to benefit, essentially. And the review made 30 recommendations, and yet over 2 years later, the Act still hasn't been reformed. The government is currently consulting on some of the recommendations, in particular, how to strengthen or amend some of the reporting criteria, and also they're looking at penalties, and they have committed to introducing penalties, which is welcome. However, simply enforcing better reporting isn't going to lead to the transformational change that's really required to address the issue of complicity in forced labour or benefiting from forced labour in corporate supply chains. And so Autwa and ourselves and many others working on these issues, particularly, you know, people who are in conditions of or at risk of forced labour, need this Act to be substantially strengthened, because it's been a long time for an Act to be there without creating effective change.
And so, Ramila, perhaps you've been, of course, at the head of the organization for quite a while now. You've been involved in this advocacy space for quite a while. Have you noticed some sort of advancement on the issue of not only the Uyghur genocide, but specifically the Uyghur forced labor issue in Australia? And has this, you know, do you think this case is going to advance this?
Since we've been doing this in 2020, the organization being established, we haven't seen any tangible and rewarding change for the community, unfortunately. You know, we have done a lot of awareness to the community, to the industries. People are aware of what's happening, but when it comes to the crux of it, I don't think tangible action has been taken, and no one is willing to take it at this stage. We hope that this case will put a lot of industries on notice. You know, you can go into other countries, Southeast and countries, for example, and do the audit yourself and bring out reports and bring it to awareness and take action. But in East Turkestan, we can't. So this is much deeper, much bigger, and much graver than any other forced labor. So we hope that this will, and I think it has. We are getting a lot of positive messages and awareness around this, and we just hope that continues, which will in effect continue and become something that you know, tangible actions by the government and the industries will take action on.
I think you really touched on a really important point, that the fact that this Uyghur forced labor is not like any other programs of forced labor. It's a state-sponsored, state-incentivized program where also there's this punitive aspect to it. If you refuse the labor programs, if you refuse to be transferred to a Chinese province thousands of miles away from your home, and also the separation of families, I think that's also not very much talked about, or the companies, they don't necessarily know. I remember when I was briefing company corporate, the corporate sectors and stakeholders within the corporate sector, they didn't know about any of this. They just had heard about the headlines in the news, but they didn't know the extent of it, the programs, the detailed, like the ads that were put on by the Chinese government, or even the companies to hire Uyghur workers, you know. And so I think it's something, I think this is a great momentum. This is a great opportunity to bring this back to the agenda, to bring this, bring more awareness and light, as you said. And I think the other important aspect to this is that there's no real transparency, and there's a lack of due diligence. And there's not only a lack of due diligence, but I think the impossibility to have due diligence. So there's often a gap between public ethical sourcing claims and actual supply chain transparency. So perhaps to both Freya and Jennifer, what kind of due diligence should companies really be doing in specific cases where it's really impossible to conduct due diligence, specifically according to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, when you have such atrocities happening on a territory, in a region, at such a widespread, systematic way? How can companies actually conduct proper due diligence in instances where independent audits are practically impossible, where people, the workers, have no freedom of speech or assembly or opinion?
I'll let Freya talk a little bit more about sort of the due diligence, but I think as a single comment is that if you can't do due diligence, then I don't think you should be purchasing. I think that's a really clear indication about what's happening. That I don't think it is enough to say we don't know. I think you need to find out, or if you can't find out, then maybe it's not where you should be purchasing your goods from.
Yeah, I agree with what Jennifer said. Like, the alarm bells have been ringing for a very long time in relation to these risks of Uyghur forced labor and also all of the other systemic atrocities that have been happening over a period of many years now. And retailers all around the world have been on notice of these risks. There's been a lot written, and there's been a lot written about how companies can work around these risks in conducting due diligence. And so while in a situation where the company can work proactively and collaboratively with suppliers to lift conditions, that's the first, that's what everyone would want. Best practice isn't to cut and run. Best practice is to lift conditions, to ensure people are being paid fairly, to ensure that they're safe at work. But where that's not possible because of government policy or other forms of significant human rights concerns, such as what's happening in East Turkestan, then companies must divest from those risks. And so that is best practice in relation to that specific risk.
Yeah, and it's something also that I think Kmart has raised during on this case as well, that they've claimed that they have been procuring. I think they've been working on with this program, ethical sourcing program, I think. So what have you been able to tell them that there's no way to conduct due diligence in the region?
We haven't spoken to Kmart directly about the due diligence that they should or should not be doing. And we recognise that Kmart does have an ethical purchasing program. But what we've asked Kmart to do is to give us the detail of the due diligence that they're doing. And it's impossible for us to really know what they are or aren't doing, or the depth of that due diligence, without seeing the documents. And that goes back, I guess, to this case and why we've asked for the documents, because otherwise it's empty words. It's great to have a program, that's wonderful, but if the program doesn't mean anything, all it's doing is misleading Australian consumers into believing that they're buying something that has been sourced ethically.
Absolutely. I was asking this because previously in our communications with some of the companies that are also part of different programs like the Better Cotton Initiative, these programs have came out after our campaign saying that they no longer work in the region because of these questions about forced labor and also the state-imposed aspect of it. So they've actually withdrew these programs. So it's something that I think is also indicative of the systematic oppression and the widespread use of forced labor in China overall, but also specifically in East Turkestan. To maybe Jennifer, if you want to also answer this question, maybe also Freya, how does Australia compare to jurisdiction like the US or the EU in addressing forced labor? As you know, the first legislation countering Uyghur forced labor came from the US, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was which has been implemented for the last few years, and based on that law, which has a pretty strict, I think it's a pretty strict legislation that has banned tons of shipments from the region linked to Uyghur forced labor. So how does this compare to Australia? And is this case perhaps a turning point for a legislative reform or when?
I can take that. So Australia has been looking at how to strengthen its modern slavery framework for some years. And a few years ago, a bill was introduced and passed in the Senate, which did purport to ban forced labour regardless of geographic origin. So that imported goods made with forced labour would be banned from entry into Australia. And it was never then introduced into the House of Representatives, and then it fell away. However, the current government has made a platform commitment to establishing an import ban. There's no details or process for what that would look like, but that is something that we're calling on the government to look at more attentively, because there's no excuse to be importing goods where there's credible evidence that they're being made with forced labour. And there are regimes and ways to do this that are practical and that can be replicated from other countries like Canada, the US, and the EU now. And so that is an obvious way that our laws can be strengthened. But also, Europe is now working through the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and that's the other part of it, requiring companies to actually legally investigate, address and prevent human rights concerns within their operations and supply chains, and holding them accountable where they fail to do proper human rights due diligence. And so that's another way in which Australia could look to what's happening overseas and strengthen its laws so that our companies are held accountable where they don't ensure that people are working in safe and fair conditions and allowed to enjoy the same basic human rights that all of us would want to enjoy.
Yeah, and we have been very much involved in pushing for stronger legislation in Europe, specifically around the CSDDD, as you mentioned, and the forced labor regulation. There have been a couple of disappointments over the last year about how the law was weakened on some of these issues, for example, how it's not targeting bigger mid-sized companies and some other, I think, weaknesses. So we're hoping that we're following this very much closely, and we're hoping that in the upcoming calendar year, we can do much more campaigning and pressure on not only the companies, but also the European institutions specifically, and the European member states. So what message do you hope this case sends to other companies operating in high-risk sectors, specifically tech, fashion, solar, and agriculture as well?
I think this is one for Ramila.
Anyone?
Ramila?
So we would like to see other industries also take note, and I think they are watching this case as well, because a lot of the products in Australia are made in China. So we'd like to think that they are taking a positive, educated, awareness of this. We'd like to think that we've made them educated in the sense that Uyghurs are actually literally losing their lives in making the products that are coming into Australia.
And I guess to Freya, Jennifer, so this is, of course, a legal step, but what kind of, what other steps can we take in terms of also, I guess, raising awareness within the consumer base audience, within the political audience, and others? Are there other things, other steps that perhaps we can take?
Sorry, Smriti, I missed some of that question, but I think, is it what can others do outside from this case? I mean, I think that people all around the world have been doing a lot on this issue. This is by no means the only company that is facing like ramifications in terms of potential links to the region. This is a widespread issue, and so the work that is going around in terms of holding companies accountable, holding governments accountable is all really important, and and it's by no means in vain, I suppose.
And I think it's a really interesting issue that, you know, anyone can have and have a part in that everyone has purchasing power, and you know, I think we would ask everyone to exercise that purchasing power carefully. You know, shop ethically, ask questions, you know, demand to know the answers to those questions. And I think that that's a really powerful thing that an individual can do every day. It's not this isn't just something for the politicians.
Absolutely. And I think in this day and age where online shopping has become, you know, so easy, I think one must ask itself, why is it so cheap? Why is a t-shirt less than $5? For example, if you go on Shein or other online platforms where they sell these things for less than, you know, $5, there needs to be, I think, some alarms that kind of, you know, raises within someone's head when purchasing these things. And I think we have to find alternative ways. I mean, I think thrift shopping, vintage shopping, I think these are also ways to, you know, not only counter forced labor, but also to have less waste as well. I think it has also an environmental impact. So that's something that we have to consider as our climate is also quickly changing around the world. Perhaps last question for Ramila. For how do we ensure that Uyghur survivors of forced labor are not just symbols in these campaigns, but also centered in the legal and political responses? Because for many of us, for many Uyghur families and survivors, justice feels far away. And of course, these legal cases are very important, but sometimes they take years. So it's for us, it takes a long time to see the tangible results. So how do you empower them, and how does that, I suppose, what kind of message does this send to the Uyghur community in Australia and beyond?
I think it's very difficult. As you know, it's very difficult to keep the motivation and the inspiration alive within the Uyghur community, especially with China's propaganda of, you know, the visit-free visa. We've seen a lot of people go and all that. So it is extremely, extremely difficult. But knowing that you've got support, and as we do with the Human Rights Law Centre and Maurice Blackburn, and the community around us gives us hope. You know, we always have to live with hope. If we give up now, it's just going to regress, and we don't want to do that. And to get it this far and to, you know, to file the case, we know that we'll see what the next steps are. But to get to that point was a huge, huge milestone, and a lot of tears and frustrations, and not just by me, but my whole team and everyone else who supports us. But the fact that we've come this far, I think that's motivation enough that we were able to do this, and we can take it to the next step, and we can keep educating, and we can keep talking about the situation. I think that is important, that we don't stop talking about it. We keep talking about it and keep inspiring the next generation to do more. I'm not sure if I'm going to see a free East Turkestan in my lifetime. I'm not sure if I will ever be able to go back and see my cousins again, but if I don't do it, who's going to do it? And if we don't do it as Uyghurs, who's going to do it? So I think that is motivating us enough. And the fact that we are looked after by such beautiful women like here, it gives me a lot of inspiration and motivation to stand strong, stand firm, and to move forward. I think that's very important. And I always see it like our whole team are females. You know, we walked from the lawyer's office to the court the other day, and a lot of the supporters who supported us were also females. So, you know, do not underestimate us. We know that we can accomplish a lot of things. And I'd like to bring their strength to me to continue.
That's a very powerful message to end with. I agree. I think hope is one of our last weapons, and I think that's something that the Chinese government cannot take away from us. And I think this is a very bold step, and I think it will pave the way for more corporate accountability in the future. And it's also not easy for lawyers to take on heavy cases like this and sensitive cases like this, but I think we have to applaud your courage as well and your dedication and hard work. So thank you all of you for joining this this webinar, and I hope that we can raise more awareness by sharing this as well. So thanks again for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.